They thought no one was listening. They mocked, they laughed, they judged until the one man they never expected stepped forward, the CEO himself. And what happened next changed everything. What would you do if you uncovered prejudice and cruelty within the very empire you built to stand for fairness, dignity, and respect? The air was thick with the scent of gasoline and fried food as Daniel Carter, the 45-year-old founder of one of the nation's most celebrated restaurant chains, sat alone in his car outside a bustling location in downtown Chicago. It wasn't an inspection, not an investor visit. This was something else entirely. The whispers had been growing louder, murmurs of discrimination, of quiet cruelties lurking beneath the polished brand he had spent decades cultivating. He needed to see it with his own eyes. Dressed in a simple hoodie and jeans, he stepped out and crossed the street, becoming just another nameless figure lost in the evening crowd. The restaurant was alive with energy, smiling customers, the rhythmic clatter of plates, the inviting aroma of seasoned fries. For a moment, Daniel felt reassured, but then as he drifted closer to the counter, a different kind of energy slithered beneath the surface. Two employees huddled near the register, their voices hushed but sharp with ridicule. He watched as a young woman with trembling hands reached for her change, her faded coat too thin for the biting cold outside. One of the employees smirked, whispering to the other just as she turned away, "Probably spending her last dollars here, like that'll make a difference." The other scoffed, barely containing his laughter, "Bet she's sleeping under a bridge tonight." Daniel's jaw tightened. The woman paused near the door, shoulders sinking ever so slightly before she stepped into the night, her dignity left crumpled between the employee's careless words. Rage twisted in Daniel's chest. Not here, not in his company. But instead of reacting, he forced himself to stay silent, to watch, to listen. What other darkness had been festering beneath his success, and just how deep did the rot go? It was never just about the food. It was about dignity, respect, and the promise that every person who walked through those doors was valued. But tonight, standing in the heart of the very empire he had built, Ethan Carter felt something crack beneath the weight of bitter reality. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed softly as he leaned against the counter, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his worn-out jacket. He was invisible here, just another customer in the evening rush. He had come unannounced, dressed in clothes that wouldn't set him apart, hoping to blend in and see what his business truly looked like from the outside. The first red flag had been subtle, a forced smile, an empty greeting, but what happened next chilled him to the bone. A young man with hollowed-out cheeks and tired eyes shuffled forward in line, his fingers fumbling through a handful of change. The cashier, a teenage boy with a smirk that dripped with condescension, barely stifled a laugh. "Man, you serious?" he muttered to his coworker, rolling his eyes. "Probably gonna dig in the trash out back when he realizes this won't fill him up." The other snickered, shaking his head. "Bet he's just gonna sit in the corner, charging his phone for an hour before we have to kick him out." Ethan's stomach turned. He watched as the man hesitated, as if he had heard them, his face shifting with something unspoken, shame, maybe, or resignation. Without a word, he took his tray and walked toward a far table, his shoulders hunched as if he could make himself smaller. The employees were still laughing, their cruelty masked as casual banter. They didn't stop there. A mother with two children in second-hand coats stepped up next, her fingers tightly gripping her daughter's hand. The same smirk reappeared on the cashier's face. "Gotta love these types," he muttered under his breath. "Bet they're about to ask for extra sauce, like it's gold." Ethan clenched his jaw, his pulse roaring in his ears. He had built this company from the ground up, pouring his soul into creating a space where people felt welcome. But standing here now, watching the cracks widen, he realized something horrifying. This wasn't a one-time lapse in judgment. This was routine. This was culture. And if this kind of rot had taken hold beneath his nose, how deep did it really go? He had come here expecting to confirm or dismiss a few rumors. Instead, he had uncovered a poison coursing through his business. The question wasn't just how to fix it. The question was, how far was he willing to go to burn it out completely? Confrontation would feel satisfying, but it wouldn't root out the disease festering beneath the surface. This wasn't just about two careless employees. It was about the culture that had allowed them to feel safe in their cruelty. Had this behavior been ignored by management? Worse, had it been silently encouraged? Ethan Carter had always believed in redemption, in second chances, in the ability to course correct when things went wrong. But now, staring at the toxic reality playing out in front of him, he wondered, was this a mistake he could afford to forgive? And if he did, what message would that send to everyone else in his company? That disrespect could be laughed off, that prejudice could be excused. The very thought made his stomach turn. His food arrived with a curt "here you go," tossed onto the tray without care. No eye contact, no basic courtesy. He barely noticed it. His appetite was long gone. Instead, his mind replayed the moments he had witnessed. The man with the limp, the woman in the tattered hoodie, the hollowed-out eyes of the young man counting change. They had come here for a meal, for a brief escape, not to be made spectacles of. Ethan leaned back in his chair, the weight of his responsibility pressing down like an iron fist against his chest. He had built this company on a promise: respect, inclusivity, dignity. But somewhere along the way, that promise had been broken. Fixing this wouldn't be as simple as firing two employees. It had to go deeper. It had to send a message. He couldn't just remove the problem. He had to make it impossible for it to take root again. He had to cut it out at the source. But how? His next move had to be precise, thoughtful, and above all, unforgettable. Ethan waited. He sat still as the evening rush began to fade, as customers trickled out one by one, as the energy in the room shifted from frantic efficiency to tired complacency. The two employees relaxed behind the counter, laughing easily now, their masks of professionalism slipping further with each passing minute. They thought the night was over. They thought their actions had gone unnoticed. Ethan pushed his chair back slowly. The sound of wood scraping against tile cut through the hum of conversation. He stood, adjusting his jacket, his gaze locked onto them as he moved toward the counter. The air between them thickened, charged with an unspoken tension. One of them noticed him first, hesitating only for a second, before forcing on a lazy smirk. "Need anything else, man?" he asked, tone hollow, indifferent, uninterested in the answer. Ethan's face remained unreadable, but his voice carried a weight they hadn't anticipated. A weight that made the air suddenly colder. "Actually, yes," he said, his words slow, deliberate. "We need to talk. Somewhere private." The smirk faltered. The employee glanced at his coworker, confusion flickering in his eyes. There was something about the way Ethan spoke, the way he stood, the way his presence filled the space, that made them uneasy. "What for?" the second employee asked, his bravado thinning beneath the surface. Ethan didn't answer. He simply gestured toward the back, toward a break room partially visible behind the counter. The hesitation in their movements was brief, but there, reluctantly, they followed him inside. They didn't know it yet, but their world was about to change. The moment the door clicked shut behind them, the air inside the break room shifted. The casual bravado the two employees had worn just moments ago was gone, replaced with a thick, suffocating tension. The room itself was small, almost claustrophobic, the yellowish glow of the flickering overhead light casting sharp, uneasy shadows along the walls. A dented metal locker stood against one side, a stack of supply boxes against the other. But in that moment, the only thing that mattered was the three people standing in the center. Ethan leaned against the closed door for a brief moment, his expression unreadable, letting the silence stretch between them. He could see it in their eyes, the slow realization that this was no ordinary conversation, no routine talk from a manager they could brush off. The taller of the two employees, a lanky guy with restless hands that kept tapping against his thigh, shifted uncomfortably. The other, shorter but stockier, stood with his arms crossed, a thin veil of defiance masking the nervous energy in his posture. "Do you know who I am?" Ethan's voice was calm, almost casual, but the weight behind it sent a ripple of unease through the air. The taller one shrugged, forcing a half smirk. No, should we? He was trying too hard to sound indifferent, but Ethan could hear the uncertainty creeping into his tone. Ethan said nothing at first. Instead, he reached into his pocket, the movement slow and deliberate, before pulling out a sleek matte black business card. He turned it between his fingers for a second, watching their eyes flicker toward it, before finally holding it out. The taller employee hesitated, before taking it. The moment his eyes scanned the embossed name, his breath hitched, his skin visibly paled. You're the CEO," he stammered, his fingers tightening around the card as if it might disappear. Ethan nodded once, his arms folding across his chest. "That's right, and I was standing in line tonight, listening to every single word you said." He let that sink in before continuing, his tone sharpening. "About the customers who walked through those doors, about the man with the limp, about the woman in the hoodie." A beat of silence, his gaze locking onto them, with quiet intensity. "Even about me." The second employee, the stockier one who had been smirking so confidently earlier, started to speak, his mouth opening just slightly, but Ethan cut him off with a sharp look. "Don't." The single word was spoken softly, yet it carried the force of a slammed door. "This isn't the time for excuses." The room felt smaller now, the walls pressing in. The employee's earlier cockiness had evaporated, replaced by something far more raw, shame, guilt, and the growing dread of consequences. "What I heard tonight," Ethan continued, stepping forward, his voice now carrying an edge, "goes against everything this company was built on. I didn't spend years creating a place where people could come for a simple meal, only for it to become this." He gestured toward them, with a slow, deliberate motion, "a place where customers are mocked, where people are judged for their circumstances, where cruelty is tossed around as easily as small talk." The taller employee shifted, his fingers twitching, his gaze darting toward the floor. The stockier one clenched his jaw, his arms tightening against his chest, as if bracing himself. Ethan exhaled, but there was no softness in it, only controlled restraint. "You've turned this place into something ugly," he said, his voice low but steady, measured. "People come here because they trust us. They trust us to serve them a meal, to treat them with basic human decency. And tonight, you broke that trust." Silence. Then finally, a small fragile attempt at defense. "We didn't mean anything by it," the taller employee said quickly, his voice cracking under the weight of the moment. "It was just a joke." Ethan's expression didn't change. If anything, his gaze hardened, his eyes burning with something unshakable. He took another step forward, his presence now a force pressing against them. "A joke," he repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. The taller employee swallowed hard. Ethan let the silence drag for just a second longer, the air heavy enough to suffocate. Then he spoke again, his words precise, cutting through the fragile justification like a knife. "Tell me," he said, his voice softer now, almost eerily calm, "do you think the man you laughed at would find it funny? The man who struggled to walk through that door, who probably hears people whispering about him more than you could ever imagine. Was he laughing?" Neither of them moved. "The woman in the hoodie," Ethan continued, taking yet another step closer, "the one who probably worked twice as hard as you today, who might have had to dig through her pockets just to afford her meal. Tell me, do you think she was laughing?" The employees looked at each other now, their faces pale, their earlier arrogance, nothing but a memory. Ethan tilted his head slightly, studying them as if weighing something in his mind, and then with the same unwavering intensity, he delivered his final words, "Because I promise you I wasn't." The room was silent, except for the faint hum of the overhead light. The two employees stood frozen, the realization of their actions settling over them like a crushing weight. Ethan let the quiet stretch just a little longer, before straightening his posture, adjusting the cuffs of his sleeves with slow precision. "What happens next," he said finally, his voice once again controlled but unwavering, "will depend entirely on how you choose to respond to this moment." He turned toward the door, pausing just long enough to let the implication hang in the air. Then without another word he pushed it open and stepped out, leaving them to grapple with the consequences of their own actions. And as he walked away, Ethan knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Not yet. The silence in the break room was suffocating. The two employees stood rigid, their earlier bravado shattered. Their shoulders, once squared with misplaced confidence, now slumped under the crushing weight of realization. The air was thick, charged with the kind of tension that made the walls feel like they were closing in. Nathan could see it in their eyes, the desperate scramble for excuses for a way out. But there was none. Not this time. Humor. Nathan's voice was measured, each word deliberate, should never come at someone else's expense. He let that sentence settle in, watched as the weight of it pressed down on him. That's not humor. That's cruelty. He could have let his anger take over, could have berated them, could have fired them on the spot, but that would have been too easy. No, what came next had to be bigger than just them. It had to address the rot that had settled deep, festering beneath the surface of this store, infecting its culture. Nathan exhaled slowly, then straightened, his voice carrying a finality that left no room for negotiation. Here's what's going to happen. The employees stiffened. The taller ones swallowed hard. The stockier ones shifted uncomfortably, the arms he had crossed now feeling less like defiance and more like a makeshift shield. This isn't just about the two of you, Nathan continued, locking eyes with each of them. It's about the environment that allowed this to happen in the first place. You're both suspended, effective immediately, while we conduct a full investigation. His voice never wavered. I'll be speaking with the store manager. I'll be speaking with the rest of the team, and I will get to the bottom of this. The words landed like a gavel striking wood. The employees exchanged nervous glances, their arrogance replaced by something raw, guilt, fear, maybe even regret. But Nathan wasn't interested in apologies. Not yet, because this wasn't just about them. It was about what had been allowed to fester unchecked. Over the next few days, Nathan immersed himself in the store's culture. He spoke to employees, customers, anyone willing to share their experience. And what he uncovered was worse than he had imagined. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was a pattern, a toxic undercurrent that had been ignored for far too long. The employees who had laughed at customers weren't the only ones guilty. Others had done the same, and even more had stood by in silence, too afraid to speak up. It was easier that way, safer. The store manager, he hadn't just ignored the behavior, he had enabled it, choosing efficiency over integrity, numbers over decency. It wasn't that he agreed with what was happening, it was that he had convinced himself it wasn't his problem to fix. The kind of leadership that let rot creep in unnoticed, settling into the cracks until it became part of the foundation. And then there was Tasha. She was young, no older than 20, and had been working there for just over a year. When Nathan asked her if she had ever witnessed what had been happening, her reaction was different. She didn't look away, she didn't deflect, she hesitated, and then she spoke. I've seen it all, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I've wanted to say something so many times, but I was scared. She looked down at her hands, twisting them together. If I spoke up, they'd laugh at me too. A shaky breath, and I didn't want to lose my job. She swallowed as if forcing herself to continue. I didn't even know if anyone would care enough to do something. Nathan sat with her words long after she had finished speaking. That night he replayed them over and over in his head, each sentence a sharp reminder of the responsibility he carried. It wasn't just about reprimanding employees, it was about changing the culture, about proving that people like Tasha could speak up, and that someone would listen. So the next morning he called a staff meeting. The employees gathered, some nervous, some indifferent, others still uncertain of where this was going. The store manager sat off to the side, arms crossed, the same stubborn reluctance in his posture. But Nathan wasn't here to debate, he was here to lead. Change is coming, Nathan said, his voice carrying across the room, steady and absolute, not just here, but across this company. He let his eyes sweep over the employees, making sure they understood. Policies will be restructured, training will be revamped, and most importantly, accountability will be implemented at every level. There was a shift in the room. Some employees straightened, others exchanged wary glances. This store lost its way. Nathan continued, his tone unwavering, and that ends today. A pause. Then he turned his attention to the store manager. You let this happen, he said, not unkindly, but without any room for argument. And now you have a choice. Step up and fix it, or step aside. Silence. The manager swallowed but gave a small nod. Nathan turned back to the rest of the team. For those of you who stood by and said nothing, this is your wake-up call. And for those of you who were afraid to speak up, his gaze landed on Tasha. Just briefly, know that from this moment forward, your voice will be heard. And with that, the meeting ended. It would take time. Culture didn't change overnight. But as Nathan left that store, he knew one thing for certain. He had set something in motion, and he wasn't stopping until the foundation had been rebuilt. For good. Nathan didn't just demand change, he became the force that made it happen. Words alone wouldn't fix this. Respect wasn't just a concept, it was something that had to be woven into every aspect of the company's culture, reinforced not by policies alone, but by the actions of those who upheld them. And so the transformation began. In the weeks that followed, the restaurant underwent a shift unlike anything it had seen before. The changes weren't superficial. They weren't just about damage control. They were a correction, a deliberate dismantling of everything that had allowed toxicity to take root in the first place. Nathan didn't just reprimand employees, he rebuilt them. The two employees who had mocked customers were given a choice: walk away or learn. One of them, shaken by the weight of his own actions, accepted the offer of an intensive training program focused on empathy, respect, and the power of words. The other, he scoffed at the idea, unwilling to adapt. He quit, clinging to his misguided sense of defiance, rather than acknowledging his wrongdoing. Nathan had expected as much. Change wasn't for those who refused to see, but the biggest shift came from an unexpected place. The store manager, the man who had let complacency fester, was relieved of his position. He had failed to lead, and in failing, he had let his team sink into indifference. There was no room for passive leadership, no room for those who turned a blind eye when they should have stood up. And in his place, Tasha, the young woman who had once been too afraid to speak, now found herself at the helm. Nathan had seen something in her, a quiet strength, an integrity that had endured despite everything. She had been a silent witness to the worst of it, yet she had never lost her sense of what was right. You deserve this, Nathan told her when he announced the decision. You showed more courage in your silence than others did with their voices. Now it's your turn to lead. The ripple effect was immediate. Nathan implemented an anonymous feedback system across all locations, giving employees a voice without fear of retaliation. No longer would concerns be ignored. No longer would silence be the safest option. Every complaint, every report, would be taken seriously. Mandatory training on inclusivity and respect became the foundation of every new hire's experience. Every single employee, from cashiers to upper management, would be held to the same standard. No exceptions, no excuses. And then came the motto. More than just words, it became a promise. We serve with dignity. Every person, every time. It was printed on signs, displayed on uniforms, and ingrained into the company's DNA. But Nathan didn't stop there. This wasn't just about fixing one store, it was about sparking something bigger. He reached out to community leaders, partnered with organizations that advocated for workplace equity and inclusivity. Together they organized events, forums where people could share their experiences, where stories of struggle, resilience, and change could be heard. Employees sat face to face with real people, listened to how simple acts of kindness or cruelty could alter someone's day, someone's life, and slowly, something incredible began to happen. Customers noticed, employees took pride in their work in a way they never had before. The fear that had once kept people like Tasha quiet was replaced with something else: trust. This wasn't just a restaurant anymore, it was a movement. And as Nathan stood in the middle of it all, watching as real change unfolded, he realized something. This had never just been about the words spoken in a single night. It had been about a culture that had allowed those words to be spoken. And now, that culture was gone, replaced by something better, something that would last. For every person, every time. Nathan had always believed that leadership was about more than just running a successful company. It was about integrity, the kind of integrity that didn't waver when no one was watching. That night, standing before his employees, he knew this was his moment. This isn't just about policies. This isn't about PR, he said, his voice steady, eyes locking onto each person in the room. This is about the kind of people we choose to be, the kind of place we choose to create. But change doesn't happen overnight. It takes confrontation, it takes accountability, and it takes action. The days that followed weren't easy. As Nathan dove deeper into the restaurant's culture, he unearthed more than just carelessness. He found complacency, a pattern of quiet cruelty that had been allowed to fester. Employees who had laughed at customers, dismissed them, treated them as less than human. Managers who had ignored it, too focused on efficiency to notice the poison seeping into their team. But the most sobering discovery, the silence of those who had wanted to speak up but never did. Tasha, a junior employee, had seen it all, had felt it. The way the staff whispered behind customers' backs, the way jokes turned mean, the way certain people were made to feel unwelcome. They would have laughed at me too, she admitted to Nathan one night, her voice barely above a whisper. And I didn't think anyone would care. That stuck with him, because he cared. And he was going to make sure everyone else did too. Nathan didn't just fire people and move on. He rebuilt. A new manager was appointed. Not someone who had looked the other way. Not someone who had been part of the problem. Tasha, the girl who had been afraid to speak. The girl who had watched and waited, wondering if anyone would ever listen. You stood by your values, even when it cost you your voice, Nathan told her as he handed her the promotion. Now, you don't have to be silent anymore. The restaurant wasn't just changing, it was transforming. Anonymous feedback systems were implemented, company-wide, giving employees a way to report misconduct without fear. Inclusivity training became mandatory. Employees weren't just taught to be better, they were given proof of the impact their words and actions had on real people. And at the center of it all was a new motto, one that would define the company moving forward. We serve with dignity, every person, every time. But Nathan wasn't done. He took the movement beyond his restaurants, partnering with community organizations, launching events where people shared their own experiences, stories of being judged, dismissed, or overlooked. Stories of how small moments of cruelty had left lasting scars, and how small moments of kindness had changed lives. At one of these events, standing before a crowd, Nathan delivered the words that would echo long after the night ended. Words can heal, or they can harm. It's up to us to choose which path we walk. For Nathan, this was never just about fixing a single restaurant. It was about proving a point that leadership wasn't about profit margins or press releases. It was about values. It was about understanding that even the smallest choices, the jokes we tell, the way we look at someone different from us, the things we say when we think no one is listening, can shape the world around us. And to those who had once stood by, watching from the sidelines, his message was clear. Respect isn't optional. It's the foundation of everything. The story of what happened at Nathan's restaurant spread far beyond its walls. It became a lesson, a challenge for people to examine their own behavior, not just at work but in their everyday lives. Because in the end, it all comes down to one simple truth. Small actions, whether kind or cruel, can leave a lasting impact. So the next time you meet someone different from you, the next time you have the chance to pass judgment or offer kindness, choose kindness. You never know whose life you might change. And if this story moved you, don't just keep it to yourself. Share it, spread it. Let's create a world where dignity and respect aren't just words, they're a way of life. Because change starts with us, one step at a time.